2,000 Jewish children stopped existing in Nazi records across northern Italy, not because they were hidden in basements or smuggled through forests, but because a small village turned everyday life into a weapon. German officers walked past them daily, inspected them face to face, and never realized what they were looking at.
Stay close, everyone. Move forward in a line.
The question isn't how they hid. It's how they made hiding look so normal that the Nazis searching for them couldn't see what was right in front of them. Valdombra, a hillbound village perched above a river gorge in the Piedmont region, became the most audacious hiding place of World War II. But here's the detail that defies everything you think you know about Holocaust rescue operations. These children weren't concealed in cellars or smuggled through midnight forests. They attended catechism classes. They sang in church choirs visible from the street. They ran errands for German officers. And the Gestapo, with all their files, informants, and raids, never realized the village itself was a living forgery. How do you erase 2,000 children from Nazi records without ever making them invisible? The answer is hidden in the stone terraces and vineyards of Valdombra. And this story you're about to discover was buried for decades, not because it was secret, but because it was too quiet, too uncomfortable, and too far from the narrative of armed resistance that history preferred to remember. It was 1943. Northern Italy had fallen under German occupation. Mussolini's puppet regime in Salo collaborated with Nazi deportation orders, and Jewish families across the Piedmont region were being hunted, registered, and shipped north to transit camps. Children were torn from parents at processing centers, their names entered into ledgers that became death sentences. The Nazi bureaucracy was meticulous. Their surveillance was relentless. And in the middle of this machinery of extermination, there was Valdombra, an isolated village tucked between steep vineyards and medieval stone walls, barely 800 residents, perched so high above the gorge that winter mists obscured it from the valley below. It was poor, it was remote, and it was Catholic, but not in the way Rome expected. Valdombra's residents carried their own scars. Their grandparents remembered when Piedmont's villages had sheltered political exiles during Italy's unification wars. Their parish records held names of families who'd hidden Waldensian Protestants fleeing persecution centuries before. They knew what it meant to be marked for destruction, simply for existing. When the Nazis began hunting Jewish children, the villagers didn't see strangers from distant cities. They saw echoes of their own history, and they made a choice. This time, they wouldn't look away. It began with Don Elio Marzatti, the village priest. Slight, soft-spoken, with wire-rimmed glasses that made him look more like a librarian than a rebel. Don Elio was no warrior. He'd been reprimanded by his own bishop for sheltering anti-fascist intellectuals in the 1930s. But when the local prefect ordered him to report Jewish families taking refuge in nearby farms, Don Elio did something extraordinary. He burned the letter. Then, from his pulpit on a cold Sunday in October, he told his congregation they had a sacred duty, not to the state, not to the regime, but to conscience. He didn't ask for volunteers. He simply said, "If they come to your door, you will take them in." What happened next wasn't a resistance cell or a covert network. It was a mass conspiracy, so decentralized it became unbreakable. Farmers, shopkeepers, school teachers, elderly widows, children barely old enough to understand. Everyone knew, everyone participated, and everyone kept the secret. There were no meetings, no written plans, just quiet decisions made in kitchens, repeated across doorsteps, and reinforced through Sunday confessionals. When the first Jewish child arrived, a 7-year-old boy whose parents had been arrested in Turin. A farmer's wife simply added him to her table, gave him her dead son's name, and enrolled him in the village school the next morning. Within weeks, 3 more appeared, then a dozen. Then families began sending children north through smuggling networks, desperate to place them anywhere the Nazis wouldn't look. And like a river carving through stone, they kept coming. Toddlers, teenagers, siblings separated and reunited under false names, orphans whose identities existed only in Giulia Seravalli's rewritten ledgers. You're probably wondering how an entire village pulled this off. How did 800 people deceive the Gestapo, the fascist militia, and German occupation forces for 3 years without a single betrayal leading to massacre? The answer lies in something the Nazis never anticipated: that the most powerful weapon against their machinery of death wasn't violence or secrecy. It was bureaucracy, consistency, and the mundane predictability of village life that made lies indistinguishable from truth. And by the time you understand how they did it, you'll know exactly why this story was almost lost forever. If you believe that 800 villagers risking everything to save 2,000 children is the kind of history that deserves to be told and retold, if you think Giulia Seravalli rewriting ledgers with a pen is just as heroic as any soldier with a gun, then subscribe right now. Your subscription literally makes it possible for us to spend months researching forgotten stories like Valdombra. Like this video if you want more stories about people who didn't wait for heroes to arrive. They became the heroes, because the algorithm buries quiet courage, and we need your help to surface it. Now let's continue into the story. To understand how Valdombra became a living deception, you need to know 3 things: the priest who refused to obey, the registrar who controlled the paper trail, and the moment an entire village realized that saving children meant committing to a lie so complete, so ordinary, that even German officers standing face to face with hidden children would see nothing but Italian peasant life continuing as it always had. But before any of that was possible, you need to understand the village itself, because Valdombra wasn't chosen for this operation. It was built for it, shaped over centuries by forces that made invisibility a survival skill. The village clung to a hillside 900 meters above sea level, accessible only by a single winding road that turned to mud when it rained and ice when it didn't. There was no train station, no telegraph office, no garrison worth mentioning. German commanders driving through the Piedmont Valley below wouldn't even glance up. Why would they? Valdombra had nothing: no factories, no supply depots, no reason to exist on any strategic map. It was the kind of place occupying armies forgot about until they needed conscripts or grain. And even then, the harvest was so meager, it barely justified the fuel to collect it. This poverty wasn't recent. Valdombra had been poor for as long as anyone could remember. The earthquake of 1887 had collapsed half the village, killing 60 people and leaving families rebuilding for a generation. The Great War had taken 43 men. Nearly every household lost a son, a father, a brother. By 1943, the village had perfected a kind of institutional exhaustion, a collective shrug that said, "We've survived worse. We'll survive this." But underneath that exhaustion was something else, something the Nazis, with all their intelligence networks, never understood. Valdombra was deeply, ritually Catholic. Not the Catholicism of Rome's grand cathedrals or the Vatican's political maneuvering, but the Catholicism of saints' feast days, processions through vineyards, and bells that marked every transition in daily life. The church wasn't just a building. It was the village's nervous system, Baptisms, marriages, funerals, confessions, everything that mattered passed through Don Elio's stone sanctuary. And in a place that small, that isolated, the church didn't just guide morality. It created consensus, which meant when Don Elio said something from the pulpit, it wasn't a suggestion. It was a commandment woven into the fabric of village identity. The villagers were accustomed to obedience, but there's a difference between obedience and compliance. They obeyed the rhythms of the land, the demands of survival, the unspoken rules that kept 800 people from tearing each other apart in hard times. But compliance required belief in the authority demanding it, and Valdombra had learned, through occupation after occupation, war after war, that distant governments were temporary. The village was permanent. So when fascist officials arrived with new decrees, villagers nodded, signed what needed signing, and then did exactly what they'd always done. They'd survived centuries by appearing boring, predictable, beneath notice. Compliance was performance. Obedience was theater, and they'd perfected both. By late 1942, whispers began filtering up from the valley. Jewish families were fleeing Turin, Genoa, Milan, moving south, moving anywhere that wasn't a city with registries and deportation schedules. Some were heading for Switzerland, others toward Allied lines rumored to be pushing north. But the borders were closing, the routes were watched, and desperation was making people reckless. In Valdombra, those whispers didn't arrive as news. They arrived as questions murmured between neighbors after Sunday Mass, coded into casual conversations at the well, embedded in silences that lasted just a beat too long. What would you do if someone knocked on your door at night? Would you turn them away? Could you? The village hadn't decided yet, but it was beginning to realize something inevitable. Refugees would come, not in small numbers, not as isolated cases. They would come because Valdombra was remote enough to seem safe and poor enough to seem irrelevant. And when they arrived, every family would have to choose, not once, but over and over again, for as long as the war lasted. The question wasn't whether Valdombra could hide people. The question was whether it could hide them so well that the hiding itself became invisible. The answer arrived not as a decision, but as a man who'd already made his choice, years before anyone knew it mattered. Don Elio Marzatti had been Valdombra's parish priest since 1938, appointed reluctantly by a bishop who considered him both brilliant and troublesome in equal measure. He'd studied theology in Turin, where he'd written a thesis arguing that conscience superseded institutional authority in matters of mortal sin, a position that earned him academic honors and ecclesiastical suspicion. By 1940, he'd been formally reprimanded twice, once for allowing a known socialist to speak at a church social event, and again for refusing to display Mussolini's portrait in the parish hall. The diocese tolerated him because Valdombra was the kind of posting nobody wanted, remote, poor, forgettable. They assumed isolation would temper his defiance. Instead, it freed him. Don Elio wasn't a charismatic speaker. He didn't raise his voice or gesture dramatically. His sermons were measured, almost academic, delivered in the same calm tone he used to discuss vineyard yields or baptism schedules. Which is why what happened in October 1942 felt less like rebellion and more like a simple statement of fact. The local prefect had sent a letter to all parish priests in the region. It was brief, bureaucratic, and explicit. Priests were to read aloud a directive from the Salot government requiring citizens to report any knowledge of Jewish families in hiding. Failure to comply would be considered obstruction of state security. Don Elio read the letter once. Then he carried it to the stone fireplace in the rectory and watched it burn. The following Sunday he stood at the pulpit as he always did, hands folded, glasses catching the morning light filtering through the narrow church windows. The villagers expected announcements about the upcoming feast day, maybe a reminder about donations for winter charity. Instead, Don Elio said something that changed everything. "There are laws written by men," he began, "and there are laws written in conscience. When these come into conflict, we are not relieved of the burden of choice. We must choose, and we will be judged not by what we were ordered to do, but by what we did when the order was unconscionable." He didn't mention the letter. He didn't name Jews. He didn't call for resistance. He simply said, in that same measured tone, "If someone in danger knocks on your door, you will answer. If a child needs shelter, you will provide it. This is not politics. This is not war. This is what it means to be human." Then he closed his missal and continued with Mass as if nothing had changed. But everything had. Sitting 3 rows back was Giulia Serravalle, the village registrar. A widow in her early 50s, sharp-eyed and precise, Giulia kept the records that defined village life. Births, deaths, property transfers, school enrollments, ration cards. Before the war, it had been tedious clerical work. Now in occupied Italy, those ledgers had become instruments of control. The fascist authorities required regular updates. German officers occasionally demanded to cross-reference names against transit lists. Giulia understood something most villagers didn't. In a bureaucratic regime, paperwork wasn't just documentation. It was reality itself. If a name didn't appear in the ledger, the person didn't officially exist, and if a person didn't exist, they couldn't be deported. After Mass, she didn't approach Don Elio directly. She simply went home, opened her record books, and began studying how identities were constructed. Birth certificates, baptism records, school registrations. She memorized the templates, the signatures, the stamps. She calculated how many orphans from bombed cities the village could plausibly absorb before the numbers looked suspicious. She didn't tell anyone what she was doing. Not yet. 3 weeks later, the first child arrived. A boy, maybe 8 years old, brought by a farmer who'd found him hiding in a hay cart on the road from Asti. The boy's parents had been arrested. He had no papers, no story that would survive scrutiny. Just a name he was terrified to speak aloud. The farmer brought him to Don Elio's rectory after dark. Don Elio fed him, let him sleep, and the next morning walked him to Giulia's office. "He needs a name," Don Elio said simply. Giulia looked at the boy, then at the ledger, then back at Don Elio. "He has one," she said. "Marco Fontana, born 1935 in Alessandria. Parents killed in the bombing last spring. Sent here to live with distant relatives." She wrote it in the register with the same steady hand she'd used for every other entry. No hesitation, no ceremony. The boy became Marco Fontana. There was no meeting to discuss it, no vote, no strategic planning session. Just a priest who'd already decided, a registrar who understood the weapon she controlled, and a village that had been quietly preparing itself without knowing it. Over the next month, 4 more children arrived, then 7, then 12. Each time, a villager made a decision. A farmer's wife added a place at the table. A shopkeeper enrolled a nephew in school. A widow claimed a cousin's child and taught her to recite the rosary. No one asked permission. No one waited for orders. They simply acted. Dozens of individual choices that from the outside looked identical, unremarkable, and utterly ordinary. And that's when Valdombra stopped being a village and became something else entirely. A conspiracy so decentralized that destroying it would require destroying everyone. The system that emerged wasn't designed. It evolved through necessity, refined through repetition, and perfected through the kind of mundane attention to detail that makes lies indistinguishable from truth. Every child who arrived in Valdombra underwent the same transformation. Not in some clandestine ceremony, but in kitchens, at dinner tables, during walks through the vineyard terraces. They were given new names, always Italian, always common, always borrowed from relatives who died years earlier or moved away. Marco, Lucia, Giovanni, Teresa, names that appeared in old baptism records, that could be cross-referenced if necessary, that carried the weight of plausible history. The children became orphans from Alessandria, where Allied bombs had leveled entire neighborhoods. Or they were apprentices sent by families in the South to learn trades, carpentry, masonry, textile work. Or they were distant cousins, the children of relatives no one in the village had met, but everyone claimed to remember. The stories were boring, tragic in the ordinary way war makes everyone's story tragic, and utterly unremarkable. But a new name wasn't enough. The children had to become their new identities. They attended catechism classes every Wednesday evening, memorizing prayers they'd never heard before. They sang in the church choir, their voices blending with village children during Sunday Mass. They learned the Piedmontese dialect, dropped their urban accents, adopted the rhythms of rural speech. They were taught to cross themselves before meals, to genuflect when entering church, to recite the rosary without hesitation. Not because anyone believed religious performance would save them, but because inconsistency kills. A child who flinched at the sign of the cross would be noticed. A child who hesitated before saying grace would raise questions. So they rehearsed normalcy until it became reflex. Giulia Serravalle's ledger system was the invisible architecture holding everything together. She didn't keep one master list of hidden children. That would be evidence, a single point of failure. Instead, she fragmented the information across multiple record books, birth registries, school enrollment logs, ration card distributions, church baptism records. Each document told part of a story, and no single document revealed the whole operation. She also introduced strategic chaos. She would lose paperwork, then reissue it with slight variations. She backdated entries, making it appear that children had been in the village for years. She created redundancies, two slightly different records of the same child, filed in different offices, ensuring that even if one was discovered, the other would support the lie. The beauty of her system was its illegibility. Anyone trying to audit Valdombra's records would find exactly what they expected. Bureaucratic mess, typical of a poor rural village where a single registrar handled everything. The chaos was camouflage, but paperwork alone couldn't protect 2,000 children. They needed institutional support, and it came from an unexpected source, Captain Renzo Bellovari of the Carabinieri. Bellovari was the regional officer responsible for coordinating between local authorities and German command. A career policeman in his 40s, he'd grown up in a village much like Valdombra. He understood how these places worked. And when German officers began demanding updated census data and background checks on new residents, Bellovari did something quietly subversive. He delayed. Requests would sit on his desk for weeks. Files would be misfiled. Reports would be submitted incomplete, requiring follow-up that never came. When pressed, he blamed the chaos of war, the inefficiency of rural administration, the difficulty of gathering accurate information from illiterate farmers. He became an expert in plausible incompetence. And when Gestapo units finally arrived in Valdombra to conduct their own inspections, they found nothing suspicious. Children lined up in the village square, recited their names, their birthplaces, their parents' names. They knew their catechism. They spoke the local dialect. They had ration cards, school records, baptism certificates. Everything matched. Everything was consistent. Everything was boring. The Gestapo officers asked questions, cross-referenced documents, observed daily routines. They watched children attending school, playing in courtyards, running errands for shopkeepers. They saw a poor village absorbing war orphans, exactly as poor villages across Italy were absorbing orphans. There was nothing to investigate, nothing actionable. After 3 days, they left. And that's when Don Elio and Giulia understood something terrifying and true. Visibility wasn't a risk. Visibility was protection. Children hidden in basements could be discovered in a single raid. But children living openly, integrated into every aspect of village life, backed by documents and witnesses and daily routines, they were invisible precisely because they could be seen. The Nazis were searching for a conspiracy. They found a village doing exactly what villages do during war, surviving, adapting, and continuing as if normalcy were still possible. And because the disguise was so complete, so ordinary, so relentlessly unremarkable, it became unbreakable. For 18 months the system held. Children arrived, were renamed, absorbed. Gestapo patrols passed through, asked questions, found nothing. The village had mastered the art of visible invisibility. But perfection in wartime is a statistical impossibility. Eventually, something breaks. It was a Sunday in March 1944. The church was full for morning mass, as it always was. Villagers in their worn wool coats, children in the choir loft, German officers occupying the back pews as they occasionally did. A performance of tolerance that allowed them to observe without appearing to threaten. The service proceeded normally. Don Elio delivered a homily about the parable of the Good Samaritan, careful and measured as always. The choir sang the Ave Maria, their voices echoing off the stone walls. Everything was routine, predictable, safe. Then, during communion, an SS officer standing near the choir entrance noticed something. A prayer book left open on the railing of the loft. He stepped closer, curious rather than suspicious, picked it up, turned it over in his hands, and on the inside cover, barely visible, was an inscription in faded ink, Hebrew. Just a few words, a blessing, perhaps, or a name, but unmistakable. The officer's posture changed. He looked up at the choir, 24 children, all in identical white smocks, all singing with their eyes on Don Elio. He scanned their faces slowly, methodically, and called out in accented Italian, "Whose book is this?" The singing faltered, then stopped. Silence filled the church like water flooding a sealed room. The officer repeated the question, louder. "Whose book?" One of the children, a girl of maybe 13, went rigid. Her breath caught. Her eyes darted to the book, then away too quickly. She'd been in Valdombra for a year. She knew her name, her story, her prayers. But panic doesn't consult memory. The officer saw it, started toward her. And that's when Luca Fiorenzo stood up. He was 23, a monastery caretaker who helped maintain the church grounds and assisted Don Elio with administrative tasks. Unremarkable, quiet, the kind of young man you'd forget 5 minutes after meeting him. He'd been sitting in a side pew watching the choir as he always did during Mass. He stepped into the aisle, raised his hand, and said calmly, It's mine. The officer turned. Yours? Yes. I must have left it there yesterday when I was repairing the railing. The officer studied him, then looked back at the girl, whose face was now carefully blank. Then back at Luca. You read Hebrew? My grandfather was a scholar, Luca said, his voice steady. He collected religious texts. I keep some of his books. I didn't realize I'd brought that one to church. It was a terrible lie, implausible and thin, but it was offered. A target, a confession, an alternative to pursuing the frozen girl in the choir loft. The officer considered for a long moment. The entire congregation held its breath. Don Elio's hand gripped the edge of the altar. Then the officer closed the prayer book, tucked it under his arm, and gestured toward the door. Come with me. Luca walked forward without hesitation. He didn't look at Don Elio, didn't look at the children. He simply followed the officer out of the church, down the steps, and into the waiting Kubelwagen parked in the square. The vehicle drove away. The engine noise faded into the distance, and inside the church, no one moved. Don Elio's voice, when he finally spoke, was barely above a whisper. Let us pray. But no one could. The Mass ended in silence. Families walked home without speaking. The children were ushered quickly inside, away from windows, away from view. That night, the village didn't sleep. Fear spread like frost. Quiet, pervasive, hardening everything it touched. Luca had been arrested, taken publicly. Everyone had seen it. If he was interrogated, if he broke, if he revealed anything, the entire operation would collapse. 2,000 children, 800 complicit villagers, all of it exposed. But underneath the fear was something else, something harder and sharper: resolve. Luca Fiorenzo had stepped forward, knowing exactly what it meant. He'd claimed ownership of evidence that could destroy him, to protect a child he wasn't related to. In a conspiracy he could have ignored. He hadn't been ordered. He hadn't hesitated. He'd simply acted. And if a 23-year-old monastery caretaker could do that, if he could walk calmly into arrest to save a stranger, then no one else in Valdombra had any excuse to look away. 3 days later, word arrived through Captain Bellovari's network. Luca had been transferred to a detention facility near Turin. No trial, no formal charges, just deportation orders. He was sent north, to Germany, to a labor camp outside Dachau. He never came back, and the village, shaken and grieving, tightened its grip on the secret it now understood could cost everything, and chose to keep anyway. Luca's arrest changed the equation. The Gestapo now knew something was wrong in Valdombra, even if they couldn't prove what. They began watching more carefully, asking more questions, cross-referencing names against transit lists and deportation records, and their attention eventually landed where it always would, on Giulia Serravalle. She was too visible, too central. The registrar who controlled every official document in the village. If there was fraud, if identities were being fabricated, the paper trail would lead directly to her. They came for her on a Tuesday evening in April, 3 weeks after Luca's deportation. 2 Gestapo officers and a fascist militia translator. They didn't knock. They simply pushed open the door to her small stone house on the edge of the village square and found her sitting at her kitchen table, mending a shirt by lamplight. Signora Serravalle, you will come with us. She didn't resist, didn't ask why. She set down the needle, folded the shirt carefully, and stood. May I put on my coat? They allowed it, then escorted her to a commandeered administrative building in the valley below, where an interrogation room had been prepared. Bare table, 2 chairs, a single overhead light, The questions were precise. Had she falsified birth records? Had she issued documents to individuals without proper authorization? Had she been in contact with partisan networks? Did she know the whereabouts of any Jewish families in the region? Julia answered each question with the same exhausted patience she used with illiterate farmers who couldn't remember their children's birth dates. I keep the records as they are reported to me. If there are errors, they are the errors of war. People flee bombed cities without papers. Orphans arrive with no documentation. I do my best with incomplete information. While she was being questioned, Gestapo officers ransacked her home. They tore through cabinets, emptied drawers, pried up floorboards. They were looking for the master list, the hidden ledger that would expose the entire network. They found nothing, because 3 days after Luca's arrest, Julia had done something extraordinary. She'd dismantled the records entirely, not destroyed them. That would leave gaps, raise questions, create evidence of tampering. Instead, she'd distributed them. Every household hiding a child now held fragments of the documentation that proved the child's false identity. A baptism certificate here, a ration card there, a school enrollment form tucked into a family Bible. The information still existed, but it was scattered across 200 different homes, impossible to reconstruct without searching every building in the village. And even if the Gestapo did that, even if they seized every document in Valdombra, they'd find exactly what they expected: the chaotic, redundant, poorly organized records of a rural village managed by a single, overworked registrar. The interrogation lasted 6 hours. Julia gave them nothing because there was nothing to give. She hadn't memorized names. She hadn't kept coded lists. The system existed in the collective knowledge of the village, and you couldn't extract that with threats or exhaustion. At dawn, they released her, not because they believed her, but because they couldn't prove anything, and in occupied territory, suspicion without evidence was just noise. Julia walked back up the hill to Valdombra as the sun rose over the gorge. Her house was destroyed, furniture overturned, shelves emptied, papers scattered like leaves. But she didn't care about the mess. She cared that the system had held. That night, Don Elio convened quiet conversations across the village. Not meetings, just visits, kitchen to kitchen, doorstep to doorstep. The message was simple. The network had to decentralize completely. No central authority, no single point of failure. Every household had to operate independently, making decisions without coordination, trusting that others would do the same. Children were moved, not hidden, but redistributed. A boy who'd been living with a farmer for a year was sent to stay with the farmer's sister in the next valley over. A girl was transferred from a shopkeeper's home to a widow's cottage on the village outskirts. On paper, these were ordinary wartime adjustments, families sharing resources, children being sent where they could be fed. But the effect was strategic. If the Gestapo returned and arrested anyone, they'd find only fragments, pieces of stories that didn't connect, children who'd already moved, trails that went cold before they led anywhere. The system didn't just survive Julia's arrest, it evolved because of it. And in the Gestapo offices in the valley below, frustration mounted. Officers reviewed reports, cross-referenced names, searched for patterns. They knew something was happening in Valdombra. They could feel it, the way hunters sense prey just beyond the tree line. But every time they moved closer, the trail evaporated. Every lead dissolved into mundane rural chaos. Every suspect had an alibi, a witness, a plausible explanation. They were hunting a conspiracy that had no leaders, no structure, no communications they could intercept. They were hunting a village that had become the disguise itself. And they were losing. The letter arrived in June 1944, passed through a chain of partisan couriers, smuggled across checkpoints and military lines until it reached Don Elio's hands. It was wrinkled, stained with dirt and sweat, addressed to no one in particular, just Valdombra. Luca Fiorenzo was dead. He'd lasted 3 months in a labor camp outside Dachau. Dysentery, malnutrition, and the brutal work details had killed him slowly. A priest, imprisoned alongside him, had smuggled the letter out, honoring Luca's final request. Don Elio unfolded it with shaking hands, expecting prayers or messages for family. Instead, he found something else entirely. Instructions. Luca had written down every child he remembered from the choir loft. Not their real names, he didn't know those, but their false ones, their assigned families, their locations within the village. He'd documented gaps in the cover stories, inconsistencies in the records, children who spoke with lingering accents or hesitated too long before answering questions. He'd created a field guide for protecting them after he was gone. There were no pleas for rescue, no words of comfort, just tactical information, written in a careful hand that grew shakier toward the end, as if he'd known he was running out of time. Don Elio read it twice, then burned it in the rectory fireplace. But the message was clear. Luca had died still protecting them, and the village would honor that by refusing to break. But survival was becoming harder to sustain. In late summer, news rippled through the Piedmont valleys. The Allies had landed in southern Italy. Rome had been liberated. The front was moving north. Liberation seemed possible, imminent even, which made the Germans desperate. SS units flooded the region, determined to hold the northern territories as long as possible. Valdombra, previously overlooked, suddenly found itself on patrol routes and inspection schedules. Wehrmacht convoys passed through weekly. Gestapo officers requisitioned homes for temporary headquarters. The village that had survived through invisibility was now under constant observation. Roads leading in and out were sealed. Forests were watched by sentries. Travel permits were required for any movement beyond the village boundaries. The children, who had lived openly for 2 years, were now trapped. They couldn't attend school. Too many new officers in the valley who might recognize faces or notice inconsistencies. They couldn't work in the fields. Patrols passed through the vineyards daily. They couldn't even play in the courtyards without risk of a random inspection, a spontaneous roll call, a German officer deciding to interrogate children for no reason other than boredom. So they stayed indoors for weeks. Families with 3 or 4 hidden children packed them into cellars during the day, attics at night. They moved them between houses after dark, rotating locations to avoid patterns. The children learned to stay silent for hours, to eat without making noise, to exist as ghosts in their own temporary homes. Winter came early that year. Food grew scarce. Rations, already meager, were cut further as German forces requisitioned grain and livestock. Families that had been feeding extra mouths for 2 years now struggled to feed anyone. Children grew thin. Colds turned into fevers, and desperation made people reckless. There were near mistakes. A child coughed during a house inspection. A false name was momentarily forgotten when a German officer asked a question too quickly. A widow, exhausted from weeks of hiding 4 children in her root cellar, accidentally referred to one by his real name in front of a fascist militiaman. Each time, the village scrambled to cover the error. Witnesses provided alternate explanations. Captain Bellovari intervened with misfiled paperwork. Don Elio offered distractions, theological debates, anything to redirect attention. But the margins were collapsing. The system that had held for 2 years through careful rehearsal and collective discipline was being held together now by luck and improvisation. And everyone knew luck doesn't last forever. By December, the situation had become unsustainable. Over 300 children were trapped in Valdombra with no way out. German forces showed no signs of retreating. The Allies were stalled south of Florence, still hundreds of kilometers away. Winter made mountain crossings to Switzerland nearly impossible. The village was a pressure cooker. One raid, one betrayal, one officer deciding to conduct a full census and compare it against pre-war records. Any of these would trigger a massacre. Don Elio stood in his empty church one evening, staring at the crucifix above the altar. For the first time since Luca's arrest, he allowed himself to consider the possibility that they'd miscalculated. That visibility hadn't been protection, just a delayed death sentence, that every child in Valdombra was living on borrowed time, and the debt was about to come due. The village had survived by turning normalcy into camouflage, but there was nothing normal about the suffocating silence of December 1944, the hunger in children's eyes, or the way families glanced toward the door every time boots echoed on cobblestones. They were still hidden in plain sight. But the sight was narrowing, the net was closing, and annihilation felt not like a risk anymore, but an inevitability. The warning came on a Monday evening in January 1945, delivered not through partisan networks or coded messages, but through a quiet conversation in a shadowed doorway. Klaus Währinger was an SS adjutant assigned to regional security coordination, a desk officer essentially, responsible for scheduling patrols and compiling intelligence reports. He'd been stationed in the valley for 6 months, observing Valdombra with the same clinical detachment he applied to every assignment. He'd noticed inconsistencies, population numbers that didn't align, too many orphans for a village that size, records that dissolved into chaos whenever scrutinized. He knew something was wrong. He'd always known. But knowing and acting are different things. And after 6 months of watching villagers go about their routines with a kind of defiant ordinariness, after seeing children sing in church choirs and run errands and live as if they had every right to exist, something in him had shifted. He found Don Elio walking near the rectory after evening prayers. "Father," Währinger said quietly, in careful Italian, "you have 2 days." Don Elio stopped, turned, said nothing. "An SS battalion is being redeployed from the south." Währinger continued, his voice barely audible. "They will arrive Thursday morning. Orders are to conduct a complete census. Every household, every resident, cross-referenced against 1940 records." He didn't elaborate, didn't need to. If the census happened, the operation would be exposed. Every fabricated identity, every hidden child, every complicit villager. "Why are you telling me this?" Don Elio asked. Währinger looked at him for a long moment, then said simply, "Because I am not required to report this conversation until Wednesday." He walked away. Don Elio stood frozen for 10 seconds, then ran. Within 2 hours, the village mobilized with a precision born from 2 years of practiced deception. There were no meetings, no debates, just whispered instructions passed door to door. Every child over the age of 5 would be evacuated. Not hidden, not buried deeper, moved out entirely. The route was insane. Wine carts traveling at night through vineyard trails, mule trains crossing forested ridges toward the northern border, river ferries operated by fishermen who asked no questions. The destination was vague. Partisan-controlled zones, neutral territories, anywhere that wasn't Valdombra when the census began. It was reckless. It was desperate. and it was the only option left. Families began saying goodbye at midnight. No one knew if it was temporary or final. Mothers held children they'd raised for 2 years, whispered reassurances they didn't believe, and sent them into the dark with strangers who promised nothing except to try. Don Elio stood in the church courtyard, blessing each cart as it departed. Julia Serravalle distributed forged travel documents, hastily made, barely plausible, but better than nothing. Captain Bellovari delayed patrol, schedules, rerouted checkpoints, created gaps in surveillance just wide enough for children to slip through. Over 300 children, 48 hours, dozens of moving parts, any one of which could fail catastrophically. A cart axle broke on a mountain trail. Children transferred to mules mid-route. A river ferry nearly capsized in the current. Fishermen held it steady long enough to cross. A Wehrmacht patrol stopped a wine cart at dawn. The driver offered samples, joked about smuggling, deflected suspicion long enough for them to move on. Mistakes happened. But luck, exhausted and threadbare, held one last time. By Wednesday evening, the village was nearly empty of hidden children. Only the youngest remained, infants and toddlers, too small to travel, hidden now in the traditional way. Cellars, attics, silence. Thursday morning, the SS battalion arrived. They found a village still reeling from winter hunger, still absorbing war orphans, still maintaining its ledgers with exhausted bureaucratic tedium. The census was conducted, names recorded, documents inspected. Everything matched. Everything was unremarkable. The officers spent 3 days searching for evidence of conspiracy. They found none, because the conspiracy had already moved beyond their reach, scattered into forests and river valleys and partisan camps, guided by farmers who remembered every trail and villagers who'd spent 2 years perfecting the art of plausible lies. On Sunday, the SS battalion withdrew. The war was collapsing. German forces were retreating north toward the Alps. There were more urgent battles to fight than chasing ghosts in a hillside village that had nothing worth taking. Valdombra survived. Not unscathed, not without loss, but alive. And 3 weeks later, when Allied forces finally pushed through the Piedmont valleys, the village gates opened not to liberators, but to children returning, some carried by partisans, others walking alone, all searching for the families who'd sent them away, not knowing if they'd ever come back. They had, and Valdombra, against every historical probability, had kept its promise. Liberation came quietly to Valdombra. No triumphant parades, no newsreels, just Allied forces passing through on their way north, pausing long enough to confirm the German retreat, then moving on. The war in Italy was ending, but the village barely noticed. It was too busy counting the living. The truth emerged slowly, in fragments. As children returned from partisan camps and border crossings, as families reunited in tearful embraces or devastating silence, the scale of what Valdombra had accomplished became undeniable. Over 3 years, the village had absorbed, renamed, and protected approximately 2,000 Jewish children, and the survival rate was staggering. Over 90% had made it through the occupation. But survival came with a cost most villagers hadn't anticipated. The majority of the children were orphans, parents, arrested in 1943 hadn't returned from transit camps. Families deported to Auschwitz or Treblinka were simply gone. The children who'd been given false names and new histories to survive the war now had no homes to return to, no relatives searching for them. Just the hollow realization that the identities they'd assumed weren't temporary disguises anymore. They were all that remained. The Italian government and Allied authorities arrived with plans: displaced persons camps, Jewish relief organizations, bureaucratic systems designed to process orphans and resettle them in institutions where they could be cared for properly. Valdombra refused, not loudly, not defiantly. The villagers simply didn't comply. Families who'd sheltered children for 2 years didn't see them as temporary charges anymore. They'd celebrated birthdays, nursed fevers, taught trades, absorbed them into kinship networks that had nothing to do with blood and everything to do with survival. Adoption papers were filed, not all at once and not without complication. Italian law in 1945 wasn't designed for mass interfaith adoptions. But Don Elio, Giulia Serravalle, and Captain Bellovari navigated the bureaucracy with the same methodical precision they'd used to falsify records during the occupation. Only this time, the records were real. The children who wanted to reclaim their Jewish identities were supported, not hidden. Synagogues in Turin sent rabbis to Valdombra to teach prayers the children had been forced to forget. Hebrew lessons resumed. Shabbat candles were lit openly in homes where rosaries still hung on walls. The village didn't demand assimilation. It offered space for both identities to coexist, the name that kept you alive and the name you were born with. When authorities pressured the village to identify collaborators, informants, or fascist sympathizers for post-war trials, Valdombra gave them nothing. No denunciations, no vengeance. The village had spent 3 years protecting life. It wasn't going to pivot to retribution now. Klaus Wehringer, the SS adjutant who'd warned Don Elio, was never reported. Neither were the German soldiers who'd looked away during inspections or the fascist bureaucrats who'd delayed paperwork. The village chose silence again, but this time it was the silence of mercy. For decades, Valdombra's story went unrecorded. Historians focused on armed partisan resistance, sabotage, ambushes, liberation battles. Those were the narratives that fit post-war mythology. Heroes with guns, dramatic rescues, clear moral victories. A village that saved children through paperwork and boring consistency didn't fit. It was too quiet, too uncomfortable, too ordinary. The few official records that existed were fragmentary, buried in regional archives under mundane headings like wartime displacement and rural orphan absorption. No medals were issued, no monuments erected. Valdombra returned to obscurity, exactly as it had been before the war. The story survived because one person refused to let it die. Sarah Levi, formerly Maria Fontana, a name she'd carried for 3 years, spent her adult life tracking down survivors, collecting testimonies, and documenting what Valdombra had done. She published a memoir in 1982 that finally brought international attention to the village. By then, most of the original participants were dead. Don Elio had passed in 1968, Giulia in 1971. Luca Fiorenzo's name existed only on a labor camp death register. But the truth, once spoken, couldn't be erased again. Valdombra didn't defeat the Nazis with bullets or sabotage. It defeated them with normalcy, consistency, and collective refusal. The village didn't hide children in the traditional sense. It made their disappearance from Nazi records so complete, so ordinary, so seamlessly integrated into daily life that detection became impossible. And that's why the story was almost lost. Because the most effective form of resistance isn't always visible. Sometimes it's just a registrar altering a ledger, a priest burning a letter, a farmer adding a place at the table. Sometimes it's 800 people deciding, independently and repeatedly, that some lines cannot be crossed, and that protecting life even at the cost of your own, is the only choice worth making. That's the legacy Valdombra left behind. Not monuments or medals, just proof that ordinary people, acting openly and together, can erase lives from the machinery of genocide without ever firing a shot. Valdombra's story teaches us something crucial. You don't need to be extraordinary to do extraordinary things. You just need to act when action is required. If this story moved you, subscribe to see more untold histories that challenge everything you thought you knew about courage. And if you want another story that will leave you speechless, click the video on your screen right now. Trust me, you won't regret it.